Today's topic is the risks of buying and owning land in Ecuador. Everywhere in the world there are financial and legal risks to owning land. Some places it's really bad. For example, in South Africa right now the government's just confiscating land from people left and right. Um, However, in Ecuador there's nothing really that significant. It's a pretty good legal environment for owning land. So I'm going to kind of go down the list and tell you the basics, the things that you need to know if you're thinking about buying land here. Um, First is, of course, property taxes. There are very few countries in the world that do not have property taxes, and Ecuador is not one of them. So if you own, for example, unfortunately, rural property taxes are very cheap. So if you own like a 60-hectare rural property, the taxes might be $100 a year. And you can get exemptions in certain circumstances, and there's also municipal taxes. Those are national property taxes. Municipal taxes may be $25 to $40 a year, depending on the size of the property. So rural property taxes are very cheap. That's not even an amount worth thinking about if you're used to the high property taxes in the U.S. and other developed countries. So the next thing to think about are boundary disputes. All right, your neighbor thinks that part of that property is actually his. Right? Usually it's a very small section of the land, but still it's something you want to avoid. How do you avoid that? Well, before you even buy the property, you should have somebody do a study of the map and the title, have an engineer mark out the points, talk with all the neighbors, look at the neighbors' maps and talk with the neighbors and make sure that the map lines coincide with your map. Old property maps made a long time ago, before GPS, don't have GPS points, obviously. They were made with a topographer and sticks and a string and a measuring tape and a compass and a level, right? So anytime you buy a property in Ecuador that still has that old kind of map, the law says that you have to have it remapped with GPS points, and usually the seller will do that. If the old map says it's like 20 hectares, when it's remapped, because it'll be more accurate, it may end up being like 18 hectares or 22 hectares. You can write a clause in your promise of sale contract that will allow you to adjust the price based on that, because otherwise the owner might not want to reduce the price. The seller might refuse to reduce the price if it ends up being 2 hectares less or something, but you can protect yourself from that easily. Once you have the GPS points, or if you buy a property that already has GPS points on the map, it's really a good idea to put a cement post on every GPS point of the property. Have a contractor do that, and that lets your neighbors know that you're really serious about these are your property boundaries and you're not going to change them, right? And there's a third thing you can do if you want to be really secure. You don't need to, but you can. You can get what's called an adjudication from the Ministry of Agriculture and Land, which basically it costs about $600 to $1,000 depending on the paperwork. They come to your farm, an engineer comes, they do a study, they look at all the neighbors' maps, and then they give you an official document from the ministry that says these are your property boundaries. And if anybody wants to make a legal case against you with a boundary dispute after you have that, there's almost no chance they're ever going to win. All right, let's talk about squatters' laws. Why do countries have squatters' laws? Well, it's an attempt to maintain social equality, because some people have this like dystopian nightmare that all the rich people are going to buy up all the land and the poor people will never be able to afford it. So squatters' law gives a way for, if somebody has basically abandoned their land, somebody else can come and live on it and eventually take legal possession of it. Now, you don't have to worry about that, because unless you actually plan on abandoning your land, that's never going to happen. You see, if someone comes and just sets up camp on your land and starts to live there, you have a couple months to basically call the police and kick them out, and the police will come and kick them out. And you can also use whatever force is necessary to kick them out yourself, as long as you don't hurt them. It's better to just call the police. That usually doesn't happen. After about 2 months, basically if you let them live on your property and you haven't noticed or don't care, and it's longer than 2 months, you have to start a court case to kick them off. And as long as you do that before they've been there for a year, you're in pretty good shape. You're probably going to win that case, right? Once they've been there for longer than a year, it's going to be a lot harder to win that case. But again, are you going to abandon your property for a year and just let random people come and live there? Probably not, okay? After 15 years, if they've been living there for 15 years, you can try to make a case to kick them off, but at that point the land is basically theirs. The government's just going to partition the part of the land they're living on and title it off to them. So Squatters' laws do exist here, but it's very easy to protect yourself against them. All you have to do is just make sure, even if you're not living there, just make sure once a month, a worker that you hire walks around the property and make sure everything's good, make sure nobody's coming on it. And if somebody does come on it, you just have to call the police and they'll take care of it. It's a rare problem, squatters' law, and like I said, if you abandon your property and just don't go there for years, that's the only way that you can get taken advantage of. Repossession and debt is something to think about, right? If you owe money to somebody and a case is made against you and you lose the case, the government can, of course, just like in most countries, seize your assets and use them to pay off the debt. Examples of this are if you take a loan out from the bank and fail to pay it back, if you're a man and you get somebody pregnant and they sue you for child support, and that'll be about $100 a month, and if you don't pay it, they'll put you in jail, and if you don't pay it for long enough, they'll eventually take any property you might own. Lawsuits, if somebody sues you, you should know about libel and slander law in Ecuador. It's very strong. If you say anything bad about somebody, even if it's true, if they can prove to the courts that they lost money because of it, they'll win the lawsuit, basically. It doesn't matter whether it's true or not. So you have to be careful what you say about people. You can't just go off spouting your mouth in public about somebody's business or something just because you're mad. You should be very careful. Right? So if you lose a lawsuit, that's an example of how a lien can be put against your property. Now, they often won't seize the property outright. They'll just put a lien on it, which means that you can't sell it until you pay off the lien. However, in some cases, or if you don't pay off the lien for a number of years, they may eventually take it. As long as you behave yourself, that's not something to really worry about. Another thing is easements. It's not really like the US where if they just decide they want to use your property for something, they'll just take it. Now, that's not saying they haven't done that, but it's not very common. And for example, recently they built a really big new high tension line from one of the hydroelectric dams to one of the towns in the southeast part of Ecuador, and the electric company bought everyone's land that they were going to use. They didn't do any confiscation, and they offered a really good price for the land. They basically bought narrow corridors of everyone's land along the way. Some people refused, and then they just bought the land nearby. They just chose a different route. Most people sold the land because, like I said, they paid a really good price. It's not like in the U.S. The county government decides they want your land for a highway. They demand that you sell it to them at a very low price. You have no choice. I'm not saying that would never happen here, but it generally does not happen. You should also know about the future of your property. For example, if you buy a property that's along a river and there's already a public path easement in the map, and the public path goes up the river, you can walk for hours and there are tons of indigenous villages along the river, and the kids take a boat to school every day. You can almost bet that eventually, in 5, 10, or 15 years, all those communities are going to get together and petition the government to make them a one-lane rural dirt road so they can drive out to their communities, to their villages. It could happen. So if you're buying that property, you should know that. And if that does happen and you start trying to resist, well, sure, you can resist, but then all your neighbors are going to think that you're an asshole. So you should just assume that if you buy that property, eventually you're going to have a road where the public path once was. And that's good because it increases your property value and makes your property more accessible. And if you don't want that, then simply find a different property, right? If a neighbor wants to put a power line through your property, they have to get your permission first. And you can either refuse or you can sell that right to them. You can say, okay, pay me $500 and I'll let you put the line on there. All right. If somebody has a property behind yours, like say there's a road, there's your property, and then there's somebody else's behind it, you are legally required to grant them access to get to their property. However, you can choose the route. And it's best if that's in writing legally. For example, if you're the person with the property behind it, you should get something legal. You should get an inscription added to the title of your neighbor with the exact path of the route so they can't go and change it on you or you don't have any problems. Right? One more thing I should mention is that make sure you buy titled land. Make sure you have someone who knows what they're doing do the property paperwork. Don't buy indigenous land. Some people try to buy indigenous land. Usually what happens is an indigenous family will try to sell their land and they know that it legally can't be sold, but they'll pretend it will be, and they'll have a title that you'll sign at the notary and you'll think it's theirs or you'll think it's yours. You go there and you build a house, 5 years later they come and take it back from you, and there's legally nothing you can do because indigenous land can't be sold, right? It's part of the Indigenous Federation. It's not individually titled. If somebody sells it to you, they didn't actually sell it to you. They just made up a bunch of papers and you signed it. right? So always buy properly titled land and make sure you get a lawyer or somebody who knows what they're doing to make sure that it actually is titled and registered. Okay, there are a lot of other fine points and little things, but those are the biggest things, the most important things you should know if you're thinking about buying property in Ecuador. Any questions? Let me know.